leftists in order to come to your revolution at that time. We drove through fascist Spain, which was really horrible, to suddenly be welcomed into this deeply, passionately joyful Lisbon. We were lost as soon as we arrived here, and immediately we said, what's the way to some park in Lisbon, because we were camping, and said, follow me, and someone took us all the way, and that's how it was all the time. I can't see the atmosphere from everybody, from police, from soldiers. It was just so wonderful. And many people I know from London simply stayed here. They stayed here for a year or so. They were so happy to be here. So we came to celebrate the Carnation Revolution and to see what it was to have carnations instead of bullets in the soldiers' guns. Now, of course, the bullets are back. But what could have been more feminist than the idea of those carnations in the guns? If you think back from 100 years ago, strikes in the US, we want bread, but we want roses too. Flowers have always been significant for feminism, which is why it's nice to be at the Gulbenkian Foundation with all these flowers around us. Anyway, most of you are too young to have been there then in 1974, but perhaps just a few oldies might remember it or remember its significance, because the point I want to make in this paper is that we're all shaped by those moments in which we come into politics, or in which we come into politics in the most passionate and intense way, by the fiercest dreams that we had had, even if we later turn against them, even if we come to oppose them. Nevertheless, the significance of those times stay with us, even when they're diluted or we come to feel more cynical, perhaps, about them. I find, though, most of the people I knew in my youth haven't changed their outlook very much as they've aged. Not at all. We haven't certainly turned to the right. So many of us are in much the same place, but just slightly differently as we age, which actually is what I write about in this new book, Out of Time. The significance of aging, how we remain all the things we have been, as well as what we are today, and receiving all the projections of the world onto us as we age. However, then, I'm going to talk to you about my best moments politically, and you can say something about your best moments in order to think about how we can live our politics today in a time that really is quite similar to the close of the 1970s, for reasons which I'll go into. What happened then was that at the end of the 1960s, when I come into politics, it's a time of enormous optimism and hope. I come in with everybody thinking that we really might transform the world. But this world at the time, and the people trying to transform it, were so confidently and even aggressively so masculine in voice, style and substance, that we women who were there, as we were in almost equal numbers on the streets around the late 1960s, in an atmosphere that actually was growing increasingly sexist all around us, with the underground having more and more pornography and more objectification of women, and yet women were there alongside the men wanting a new world. So something had to give. Something had to give at the end of the 1960s, and that, as we tell our grandchildren, was the birth of women's liberation. Now, in Portugal, you had to wait just a little longer because you had to get rid of Salazar and fascism and its heritage, so you had to wait at least 5 years, and perhaps a bit longer, to beat back that heritage, I imagine. But again, you can tell me more about that. But in Britain, as in the US, the voices of women just surged out. So I often quote from Robin Morgan, "Goodbye to all that." Everyone read her poem, "Goodbye to all that," which she wrote as women occupied the radical left magazine Rat in New York in January 1970. Although, actually, another point that I have often written about is that it wasn't exactly goodbye to all that, that is the left utopianism of the 1960s. Actually, we did read those new left thinkers, Stuart Hall, Raphael Samuels, and more. And in many ways, I think that feminism took over the spirit of the new left and became the main voice of the new left, and that their politics of building from below, the importance of grassroots struggle, of direct struggle, the importance of bringing culture and personal life into politics, the significance of ideology alongside anti-imperialist struggles and anti-war protests. All those were the politics we lived day out and day out, day in and day out throughout the 1970s. Now, today, at least in Britain, I find to my delight that there is some interest in what happened in that decade of the 1970s. Even a desire to revive some of our popular magazines, such as Spare Rib. There was an attempt to refound Spare Rib. And this, of course, pleases me, since the 70s ever was and ever will be my decade, our decade, women's decade. This is when we argued, campaigned, studied ceaselessly, wanting everything to change. And we were clear in our goals, even when we disagreed in certain ways. We had these general goals of gender equality, personal liberation, community building, peace and international solidarity with the oppressed everywhere. It was a big agenda we had, and we spent a lot of time working on it. And it was this which carried us through to the end of the 1970s, when I would say women's voices had almost replaced those men's voices at the end of the 1960s, because even though we may have left power, which most women did, we didn't have women in the boardroom or other places of power. There are not even so many women in the media then. And we weren't all confident in ourselves, but we were confident in the struggle which we were fighting. We were not lacking in hope, absolutely not lacking in hope, and that is an enormous difference with the world that we're in today. We were not lacking in the marching spirit to combat inequalities and oppression by whatever non-violent means we could muster. That 60s moment had turned quite violent in the men's working of it, which was another reason why I think feminism had to take its place. And what's more, we really were successful. Change did happen, and rather fast. Change in social policies around reproductive freedoms, around the recognition of violence against women, even for some of us around the desire to live differently. Again, I wrote about that in my political memoir, Making Trouble. I write about revolutionary household rotas and things like that, getting the men involved in the home, just as we wanted more women involved in the work at large. We were going to share the new world together, and feminism was going to free men alongside women, which is why I said, is the future female? No, the future isn't female, but feminism is going to have a huge role in creating that future, which is going to be a better place for both women and men. That's what we confidently thought back then. However, interestingly, it's that decade of the 1970s when I say women's voices are heard so much more confidently, that very quickly fell into disrepute as the economic crisis sets in. And in recalling the 1970s now, you often hear of the drab, dreary decade of the 1970s, when nothing was supposedly happening. A decade of tedium and gloom, especially after 1976 with the oil crisis, with OPEC beginning to resist the West and put up its oil crisis. A period of decline is what you hear about that, and a period when supposedly trade unions got too powerful, when the lights went out. It's like the decade is sometimes summed up because of the miners' strike which happened then, when the trade unions supposedly held the country to ransom, and when women got too stroppy and started to push men out of their jobs, supposedly. In fact, it was when the economic market changed and you got a decline in heavy industry and the expansion of service work. But that's summed up as women pushing men out of their jobs. So feminism is blamed for causing part of the trouble, even causing the economic decline, and also is often blamed by people on the left for splitting the forces of the left. And moreover, by the close of the 1970s, for us facing the right, coming into power with Margaret Thatcher looming large there, for us too, it was becoming to be a newly puzzling time, despite all our successes, especially for socialist feminists, which is why I, together with my friends Sheila Rowbottom and Hulu Wainwright, wrote the book Beyond the Fragments, which came out first as a pamphlet in this press I was working at, and later on, because it was so popular, it came out as a book and we had a conference about it and so on. And we were troubled because there was many more tensions within feminism, many more splits, identity politics becoming more important, and this division, as I see it, was very much a part of the success of feminism, bringing more women in, bringing working class voices, black voices, ethnic minorities, always from the beginning, lesbian voices, debates over sexuality. But it was very easy in bad times, and we knew we were facing bad times with recession coming in and the right looming there. It was easier, or sort of partly inevitable, to start arguing amongst ourselves even more strongly, and then to try and find a single issue to unite all women. And that single issue became, not wrongly, the issue of violence, the issue of the sexualization of women's voices, but that, of women's bodies, sorry. And that was something which began to push back the voices of socialist feminism, of the left feminism that I say we came in on at the close of the 1960s. But the other thing that pushes us back, the main thing that pushes us back, is the rise of the right. The success of Margaret Thatcher in Britain in 1979, the success of Ronald Reagan in the USA in 1980. And basically the failure of one thing after another, whether it was to keep our local hospitals open, to keep our nurseries there, to unionize nursery workers, unionize people working in the public sector. All these things became struggles that were much, much harder to win. And that's why the three of us wrote Beyond the Fragments, in that we thought, look at the success we had in the 1970s, in better economic times for quite a period of the 1970s. Can't we bring that energy of grassroots struggle, those hopes, those egalitarian hopes we had to bear in strengthening the left, not by abandoning or weakening the autonomy of feminism, that was not what we wanted, but to both assert our differences but combine to form a stronger left grouping, not any particular left grouping, but just to strengthen the left as and where needed to resist the ongoing forces of the right and the havoc that was soon being wreaked on welfare and so on. And interesting, and what Sheila says is, I'm always good at titles, and Beyond the Fragments was a very good title. It was an incredibly successful pamphlet and then book. Everybody talked about it. Even the Leninist parties that her essay was written to attack said, no, we cannot ignore this book. The left of the Labour Party, like Tony Benn, our Social Democratic Party, were very welcoming of Beyond the Fragments, and even the mainstream media, such as my paper, The Guardian, Polly Toynbee in The Guardian would say, this is what we've been waiting for, someone who can talk about politics without all the jargon. So, what times those were when we could say, we could talk about socialism and and trying to organise for socialism, and everybody knew what we were talking about. Now it's much less clear what we're talking about. When we talk about socialism, it's something we really do need to discuss. But we all thought we were clear then, wasn't it? And everybody thought we were fairly clear. You know, the right had not yet shifted the whole cultural horizon as it was about to do. But the problem was, as I say, we were very popular, we were discussed everywhere. We had this big conference of 3,000 people in Leeds to work out how to go beyond the fragments. But we found that not everybody wanted to go beyond the fragments for all sorts of different reasons. People talk about chairing the workshops there and say, well, we have to go back and report to the final plenary. How we're going to try and build raging unity. They said, we don't want it. You know, we're happy where we are for one reason or another, and the organised left thought that they always had the answers anyway, so they didn't need our movement, grassroots, right back, as they always saw it. And feminists were very worried about losing their identity within some broader structure, although we were always for asserting autonomy, but autonomy within coalition. That was what we were arguing for. And although the book actually was read around the world, and people say to me it influenced the Brazilian Workers' Party, all sorts of things. I'm told, particularly by Hillary, who's always so optimistic. You know, it really had a life that continued, and we have just reissued it with 3 new essays. But the times of today are truly so different from the times then, because there were so many defeats. I mean, Thatcher, in our country, like, and I suspect the right here, was so clever in targeting trade union resistance, in targeting local councils, local resources, squeeze of funding. You know, when our Labour council was running London, she simply closed the council down, the GLC, the Greater London Council. It was too radical, it was too left, led by Ken Livingstone. Sheila and Hillary by that time were working there, their voices were everywhere in the GLC, so Thatcher just closed it down, she abolished it. And so it was very targeted attack on sites of resistance. And that, of course, was very, very significant. And what's more, Thatcher was very clear. She was a woman, but she was not a feminist. Some feminists, particularly today, welcome her as someone who showed that women can have power. Of course, women can have power. But she said, feminists hate me, and I hate them. They are a poison. And she supposedly spoke on behalf of real women, real homemakers, as if she, you know, she was only the day she was pregnant, planning to get out of that home and get someone else looking after those twins. But anyway, nevertheless, she was going to speak for all these other women who obviously weren't going to become Prime Minister and could just stay at home and carry what while we closed down our welfare services. So, what happens under Thatcher? Well, under Thatcher, poverty doubled, unemployment tripled, and inequality soared, and has kept soaring ever since. Social mobility declined and is still declining. That's what's happened, you know. That is what some of us feminists thought. We have to think of this bigger picture. And working class women, of course, in particular, not all women, but working class women in particular, were hit by the triple whammy of lower wages or no jobs, less welfare, and less advocacy on their behalf, because the funding which had come from local councils or resource centres all got closed down. People couldn't afford either to give their time to the resource centres that we'd worked in before, because gradually we were all working harder and harder, the working day was getting longer, and it just became more difficult for radical politics of any sort to continue. And Thatcher was so aware of this. What she said was, economics are the method. The object is to change the heart and soul. It was an ideological project, as Stuart Hall was always argued very strongly. It was an ideological project to change that post-war consensus, which allowed for and thought it right that there should be a guaranteed, some sort of guaranteed income, guaranteed security and freedom from fear from all. It didn't always work, but that that was a consensus. And she was determined to attack that ideological goal at every turn, and that is absolutely a total threat to the feminism that I knew, a feminism of equality and welfare provision. And so Thatcher's crusade, the crusade of the right, then as now, as right here, I know, was the rolling out of neoliberalism, a direct assault on all the securities provided by the welfare state. And this was to be done by the mobilization of fear, and that mobilization of fear has gone on from then till now, with fear, anxiety and hostility being generated by the Tory press. Wasn't just Margaret Thatcher, of course she has the whole of the Tory press behind her. The Sun, well, you don't know our press, but our main press was right behind her there, manipulating fear of economic decline, fear of foreigners, hostility towards those on benefits, routinely depicted as scroungers. I don't know what the Portuguese word, but I'm sure you have a horrible Portuguese word for the scrounger, as though the rich are never scroungers, only the poor are scroungers. And above all, fear of weakness, now packaged as pathologies of dependency on the nanny state. It becomes a psychological problem to be reliant on benefits, not an entitlement, but a psychological problem. And the attack on lack of discipline, lack of competitiveness, the attack on the permissiveness of the 1960s. So the new world of conservative dreams was to be a tougher, more competitive place, one where the entrepreneurial, but in fact only the rich, could get even richer, vastly richer, as they did, and people could be taught not to care about the fallout, to hate vulnerability and weakness, and to deny their own weakness. What could be more masculine than that? What could be less feminist than that? It's traditional values, masculine values, writ large, to be leaner, tougher, meaner, there will be blood. And there was. But through providing a daily dose of rhetoric about these scroungers and foreigners and undeserving and those coming who are supposedly taking our jobs away rather than the fact that we're no longer funding industry in the same way and so on, people buy that Tory poison, including working class people, including women, including ethnic minorities. And so you get enormous division then between what one might hope would be the forces of resistance. There was, of course, resistance. Of course there was, there always is, from feminists and from other left factions and so on. Yet still, by the close of the 1980s, so 10 years after Thatcher, who will remain in power for 20 years, in many parts of the world, not just Britain, that earlier welfare consensus had been shredded. The right and its willing messengers in the media had been so successful at inciting populist divisions, the strong against the weak, the employed against the unemployed, authority against authoritarianism, against permissiveness, and one's own country, for us of course, Britain. Why wasn't it great still? Britain, against the rest of the world, well, unless it happened to be America, in which case we do whatever they said. But most damaging of all for the left, and any sort of socialist feminism in the United Kingdom, and you'll have to explain here the effects, when our Labour Party came to power, our Social Democrats came to power under Tony Blair after almost 20 years of Tory rule, they did so little to reverse the victories of the right under Thatcher, least of all ideologically, remaining silent on how little welfare fraud there actually is compared to those being denied the benefits they were entitled to. Running scared of immigration issues, they still are. Silent again about how rarely immigrants gained access to housing or other benefits they were supposedly taking away from native Britons. And how much immigrants contributed to the economy. Yes, there was official support for women, particularly women's individual aspirations. They were no longer, the Labour Party, directly anti-feminist. Yet the whole neoliberal mantra of individual aspiration, not collective struggle, remained very much in place, and that's what is still in place. And worst of all, Labour accepted Thatcher's deregulation of finance capital, welcoming the continued influx of international capital, feeding the speculative frenzy that would amass the vast quantities of debt and the nonsense of selling off debt and so on, that finally triggered the global meltdown of 2008.